There is a certain type of person who buys luxury cars. They walk kinda snobbish, knowing they can afford the best. Therefore, they might even look a little smug, especially if they've worked hard for their money. So on the rare occasion that someone walks into an upscale showroom that doesn't fit the traditional stereotype, sales reps tend to make hasty judgments as to whether that person doesn't belong there. They are often ignored. Sometimes they enjoy humoring them. But when the salespeople go one step further and kick him out of the club, things take a very strange turn. Benny had worked at a luxury car dealership for the past 5 years. All this time, he had been doing well. He knew the business like the back of his hand and was good at his job. He was the type who could sell a car to a car salesman and revel in the prestige that came with his work. After all, not everyone could afford such luxurious cars. An important aspect of the job is to demonstrate that everything about the dealership was as luxurious as their vehicles. Their clients are very wealthy people who are accustomed to a certain lifestyle. Making a good impression was a big part of the job. Sometimes, however, the dealership receives a visit from onlookers. On this day, an elderly man who certainly looked nothing like the typical customer profile was looking through the windows of the dealership. He wasn't dressed in a smart, elegant suit and shiny shoes. He was very old, ragged, and wore a beat-up plaid shirt that had seen too many washes, a pair of khakis that looked a little too short for him, and a slouchy cap. He walked slowly through the showroom, and it didn't take long for other customers to start noticing this random customer who looked nothing like them. Benny didn't think too much of it, believing it should be a one-time thing. The old gentleman had just gone out, so he couldn't possibly harm any of the customers or employees. The next day, the old gentleman returned again. This time he stayed longer in the premises. On the third day, in fact, he went into the dealership to look closely at the cars. Benny was the first employee to approach him. While the rest of the staff ignored the old gentleman, Benny politely asked him several times if there was anything he could help him with, but he just shook his head and told him he was just watching. Up close, Benny realized the man looked older than he thought. Benny thought he might be over 80. Benny had considered asking the old man about his driving ability as an attempt to understand him better, but he didn't mean to be rude. Benny thought it best to leave him alone. After all, he was less likely to buy a car today, so Benny made no effort to chat with him. As he noted, the older gentleman seemed content to watch the cars. The old gentleman, however, ended up lingering in the shop longer than he expected. Benny offered him complimentary coffee or water several times, but not once did he accept the offer. Benny had noticed the old gentleman showing up a couple of days in a row. He was causing a lot of distraction from their other customers, who often complained about his presence. Other customers were already complaining that the old gentleman made many customers feel uncomfortable. Benny was starting to feel sorry for the man who had become a familiar face in the workplace. He figured, as long as he wasn't hurting anyone or the cars, he didn't even care that he walked around the store. Benny is used to dealing with arrogant and snobbish people on a daily basis, given the nature of their work. He didn't really like the part where he had to please people who felt they were the only ones allowed to browse the luxury vehicles. The owner of the luxury car dealership only came to the dealership once every 2 weeks. Unfortunately, the boss caught the old gentleman hanging out on the premises during his visit. The boss immediately noticed the older man who was once again looking at the cars in the back of the showroom. Being the best employee around, the boss approached Benny. According to the boss, the old man didn't seem to be able to afford any of the cars, and therefore he shouldn't have been in the shop. The boss didn't like his presence and asked Benny to deal with it. Benny tried to explain that the old gentleman wasn't doing any harm, but the boss was firm in his decision. The elderly gentleman would have to leave the building if he had no clear plans to buy a car soon. If he didn't, then there was no reason for him to stay. Benny sighed in defeat, knowing there was no use arguing with his boss. After all, he needed this job. He was hoping his boss would talk to the older gentleman himself, but unfortunately Benny had to. His boss said he had more important things to do. So, with a heavy heart, Benny walked over to the old gentleman to tell him the bad news. Over the past few days, he's enjoyed having him around the showroom for company. They hadn't talked much, but Benny liked that the old gentleman always smiled and found it very sweet. Benny liked the way the old man genuinely appreciated the cars that were there. It was a very refreshing insight from their regular customers who treated cars like a toy or a status symbol. Some of them don't even know anything about cars. The old gentleman saw Benny approaching and greeted him cheerfully by name. Benny decided to start the difficult conversation by saying something kind. Benny told the older gentleman that he was starting to enjoy his presence and energy for a couple of days. So, Benny went to the hard part of the conversation. So he tells the old gentleman that unfortunately the boss didn't like him being there for no reason. So unless he was actually going to buy a car, he had to ask him to leave. For a moment it seemed that the old man was still processing the information. It seemed that he didn't know how to react to this request. But then, he dropped his gaze to the ground and nodded slowly to himself. Then he turned away from Benny to walk out of the building. And when his hand was on the doorknob, the old man turned and thanked Benny for letting him be in the shop these past few days. He then stressed that he would not forget it. This almost broke Benny's heart. Benny returned to the back office of the dealership to report to his boss that the old man was gone. But the boss, who was already busy with another matter, completely forgot about it and kicked him out. Benny felt terrible about sending the old gentleman away and almost felt sick thinking about it. He knew the chances of seeing the old man again were slim, but he couldn't stop thinking about his last words. "I won't forget you." For the next 2 days Benny never saw the old man again. But strangely, he too didn't see any customers walking into the dealership. The shop was strangely empty, and it must have been their busiest month. Immediately, the boss instructed Benny and the other employees to get more clients. They've been phoning all day trying to find their next buyer. Since they were selling luxury cars, it was a tough sales call. Benny knew from experience that it wasn't easy to sell an expensive car to someone who had no interest in buying one. Even the wealthy don't always have a huge amount of cash lying around, ready to make a big purchase. Benny and his colleagues called several of their customers, but no one was looking for a car. It was the first time a month had gone by without either of them making a sale. It was a big crisis in the company, and no one could figure out what was going on. Days went by, when not even a soul would pass through the doors. Benny was starting to worry. If this continued, the dealership could close and he would lose his job. Benny had put so much effort into this company and didn't want to be unemployed. Even if the dealership had continued to operate with no takers, it still would have been a bad situation. Without auto sales, there would be no commissions. And without a commission, he wouldn't be earning enough to survive. When a month went by without a sale, the boss called everyone in for a meeting. Benny began to feel nervous. Things weren't going well, and he had a bad feeling that his fear of losing his job would come true. The meeting was short. The boss told everyone that the company was closing due to lack of sales. everyone would be fired. What also surprised them was that their boss not only closed and put the store up for sale, but somehow managed to file for bankruptcy. Benny and his co-workers knew full well their boss still had some cash on hand. But thanks to his lawyer, a loophole was found to allow their boss to file for bankruptcy. This was bad news for them. You see, if a business files for bankruptcy, that means the owner won't be obligated to give employees their last pay. Without the settlement, they wouldn't all have enough money to fall back on while they look for another job. Benny came home from that meeting feeling lost. He had a family to feed, and he wasn't sure he could find a new job right away. But he decided that he would keep his unemployment a secret for a while to give himself some time to come up with a backup plan. Benny couldn't believe his bad luck. He had put so much effort into his work and hoped for a promotion one day. After all, he'd been good all the time. He couldn't believe that all of his effort had gone for nothing. That night, Benny received news that infuriated him. Apparently, the boss had managed to sell a very expensive car after the meeting. While he was able to do it at a huge discount, it was still a lot of money. It seemed that the rich were getting richer and richer. While he and the rest of the employees had to go home empty-handed, his boss managed to close one last sale that gave him a tidy profit. Life was really unfair. The next day, Benny received an email notification from the dealership. The store already had a new owner, and that new owner invited all previous employees to come in because he had some questions about the dealership. Benny didn't want to go at first, but then thought maybe there was a chance the new owner could help them get a job. Benny considered telling the new owner about the wrongful filing for bankruptcy. Benny then replied to the email to inform the new owner that he would be stopping by to help with any questions he had. An appointment was made for that same afternoon. Benny was the first old employee to meet the new owner. When Benny arrived at the dealership, a secretary directed him to the office. He could see through the glass doors that the man sitting behind the desk was dressed up. He immediately understood that this man was very rich. When the door opened, Benny gasped. Their new owner was the old gentleman their old boss had sent away. He gave him a big smile and said, "I told you I wouldn't forget about you." It was the same kind and friendly eyes that greeted him, but this time the old gentleman was straighter. His crumpled cap was gone, and he wore a well-pressed suit. It turned out he was a very wealthy businessman and had had his eye on the luxury car dealership for a while. But he wanted to get an honest idea, so he decided to check it out in disguise. The old gentleman visited the shop every day for a week to get a feel for and see for himself what state the dealership was in. He also wanted to see how the staff and other customers would treat him. He added that he really enjoyed watching the cars while there. The elderly gentleman had made the decision to buy the dealership, but that day he was kicked out by the previous owner. For this reason, he had decided to change his approach. Instead of making a formal offer, he wanted to make the owner pay and lower the sale price. The older gentleman used his connections and made sure that dealership customers waited until he bought the shop before buying their cars. These customers naturally knew this man's name and accepted without hesitation. With sales and customers lacking, Benny's previous boss had no choice but to put the dealership up for sale at a very low price. The old gentleman made sure to reopen it within a week so that customers who had delayed their purchase at his request could return and continue their orders. Of course, the old gentleman immediately opened the shop so that the old employees could come back. After all, who would do a better job running the dealership than people who already knew how to do the job? Benny was relieved. He managed to survive this crisis without his wife knowing about it. Not only did the old gentleman give Benny a job back, but he also promoted Benny to manager. It seems he hadn't really forgotten about him. Soon, the old staff were back at the dealership. Everyone congratulated Benny on his well-deserved promotion. The luxury car dealership reopened 3 days later. And as expected, customers are back. Benny has never seen the store this crowded. They were making big sales again. Benny couldn't be happier. In the end, everything seemed to work out for him, and all of this was made possible simply because he had been nice to an elderly man. Isn't it amazing what a simple act of kindness can do for you? And you? What would you have done in Benny's place? Would you have kicked the old gentleman out of the dealership? Do you think the world needs Benny's kindness? Comment below what you think and subscribe for more similar stories, and follow us on Instagram.